All right, this section is focused on strings, which as we know by now are simply collections of sequenced characters. Now those characters can include letters, numbers, as well as symbols like the dollar sign or the exclamation point. So let's do a quick review of what we know so far about strings. Strings are written in double quotes, so I can write something like puts, hi there, I'm a string, and the contents of the double quotes, everything within them is what makes up the string. We can see it output right here. And notice that the double quotes don't show up here on the right because I'm using puts instead of the p method. If I did p, those double quotes would show up. However, they're still not technically part of the string. That's just the syntax that we write to tell Ruby that what we're inputting in between the quotes is a string. All right, so let's give you another example with a couple characters and numbers. I can write puts. I can also include characters and numbers. Here's a colon, that's one example. We have a hashtag. Let's skip that interpolation syntax. We have the dollar sign, the exclamation point, at 59, and all of this is no problem. On the right, you can see that that string outputs, so all of those characters are valid. Keep in mind as well that empty spaces also count as a valid character. They're just another thing in that sequence of characters that comprises a string. So right here between I and can is a space, but that counts as a valid character. So when we call a method like length, that will be included. Strings, of course, can be assigned to variables. For example, I can do name equals Boris or revenue equals $23. There we have a combination of symbols and numbers and letters. But again, to Ruby, this is all just characters behind the scene, and we can output all of these to the output. By the way, if I haven't covered this so far, when you're using something like puts, what you can do is write the variable names and separate them with a comma, like puts name, comma revenue, and all that's going to do is just output whatever you put in that list and include all of it. So we can see both my name and that revenue variable are printed out to the right with a single put statement. That's just a little bit of a shorthand or a shortcut, a little bit less text that you have to type in order to get the same result. Now, as I mentioned, a space counts as a character. So if I even create a variable like space and set it equal to a string with a single space, that's a valid string. That's a valid string just like any other. I can output space. I'm going to put the P in this case, and we can see here between the double quotes here that there is a space. It's a character just like any other. In fact, you may recall that length method that we can call on a string which tells us the number of characters, and here I can just call the length method and we're going to get 1 for that space. Let me create some space in our output with a put statement right here, and let's also talk about empty strings. An empty string is simply one without any characters. It sounds kind of weird, but it's totally possible. So if I have a variable like empty, what I can do is simply set it to this, basically double quotes and double quotes, the closing and the beginning, or rather the beginning and the closing, but nothing goes within it. It's basically a string without any characters. I can still output it. We're not going to see anything remarkable. You can see it's just a pair of the quotes, and if I do something like call the length method, we can see that the actual length is 0. There are still 0 characters within the string, but it's an empty string. It's still a string object underneath. Speaking of finding out whether something is a string object or not, there is a familiar class method that we can call on any object in Ruby, much like we called it on integers or fixed nums in the past, or float objects in the past. So let's try something like calling the class method on our name variable, which we defined up here. If I do name.class, we can see here that it's going to return a string object. And as long as it's a string, it's going to give me the exact same result. So if I do something like space.class, or even revenue.class, or even empty.class, all of these are strings. You can tell because they're in the double quotes. And here we see the output is all a consistent string. As soon as you see that double quotes, that's your dead giveaway that what you're dealing with is a string. Now let's wipe our code clean, and I just want to conclude this lesson by showing you an alternate syntax that you can use to create a string. A string can also be created by calling the new method on the string class. This is something new that we haven't seen before. But basically, things like classes, which are the blueprints that make objects. So the classes that we've explored so far are the string class, the float class, the fixed num class. Those classes have methods that we can call on them as well. And there's a method that we can call on the string class, which we just saw, called new, and that allows us to create a brand new string. For example, if I do string, which again represents the class or the blueprint that makes up our string, I can simply call new, Then this is a method that requires parentheses, or rather doesn't require it, but it's probably the most community accepted standard for how you do it. And within those parentheses, this is the input that we're giving to this method. This is our thing that we're feeding it in order for it to give us something back. In this, in double quotes, we can write whatever string we want to make. For example, I can write Boris, and let's say we assign this to a variable like name, and output name. You can see it appear right here. Now, of course, the first question you're probably going to say is, if this syntax right here accomplishes the exact same result, why would I ever need to use this syntax? And that's a pretty accurate point. Generally speaking, if you look at professional Ruby code, you should generally stick with the literal syntax, as it's called, of simply using the double quotes. I just wanted to show you that this is allowed, this is possible. When we begin to understand more about objects and how Ruby creates strings, we'll understand why this is allowed. It's something that's available on basically any object that exists in Ruby, but this is allowed for strings as an alternate syntax. Let me also wipe this clean again and just conclude with one last way we can create strings. So far, we've basically been generating them from scratch, but as you may recall from the previous section, we have methods like toS, which return a string to us. Certain methods on other objects will also create strings. So for example, if I have a number like 5, that's something that currently belongs to the fixNum class. We can see it right here. But if I call the toS method, I'm going to get a string back. We can immediately tell by the presence of the double quotes in our output, but just to confirm, I can attach that class method at the end. And again, this is doable because what I'm getting back from this operation is a string object, and every object is going to have a class method on it. This is what's called method chaining, because we're creating a chain or a sequence of consecutive methods. And when I run this, we can see true to form string appears here. So the toS method, when called on something like a fixNum or a float or even a string, to be fair, will return a string object. So there's many different ways that we can arrive at a string, which again is just a collection of sequenced characters. So this has been a quick review of what we know so far about strings, and throughout this section we'll be diving into some advanced functionality with this object type. I hope you're excited, and I will see you in the next lesson.